the big argument that I'm going to make today is that mosque or masajid have always been cosmopolitan hubs in the Muslim world, and that has been so for many, many generations. And I actually see a lot of similarities of the mosque that we have in Southeast Asia in Bosnia. It feels like home here. I was telling Ermin that the mosque here is so open to everyone, women, children. There was a kid, we were in the mosque 2 days back, and this kid was making noise in the mosque, and the imam was celebrating it. And this is the point that I'm going to make today, that when you come to Southeast Asia, and hope that we will have a workshop in Southeast Asia, you will see that mosques in Southeast Asia are not hubs of exclusivity, but hubs of inclusivity. And this is the big argument that I'm trying to make in a series of books, how Southeast Asian Islam ought to be factored in our discussion of global Islam as a whole, because it is a hub of Muslim cosmopolitanism. I'm going to move in 3 different directions. I'm going to start with the theoretical, and then I'm going to go into the historical, and then following which I'm going to move into the empirical or more ethnographic way of looking at Islam in Southeast Asia through the medium of the mosque. Now, we need to understand, again, Tavin has done a very excellent presentation just now, that mosques in not only Southeast Asia but the world today are generally under threat. We are in an age of Islamophobia, and currently the attacks in Palestine has made things worse actually for Muslims all over the world, and that mosque has always been a center of contestation. In the US alone, according to Martha Nussbaum, between 2010 to September 2010, May 2010 to September, the American Civil Liberties Union counted more than 30 mosques that have faced vandalism, public protest, strong opposition based on hostility to Islam. And in Sweden, just a few days ago, one mosque was burnt down, basically. So it's not a good time for the mosques all over the world. And mosques have always been cast as places where radicals, fundamentalists, extremists are, in a sense, fostered and nurtured. And this is a product of the global Islamophobia that we have today. And again, Tavin's book totally got into the heart of it, how mosques then become not only sites of contestation, but also spaces of resistance to fight against Islamophobia and this whole idea that we are guilty until proven innocent. And this has a lot of implications in the study of mosques all over the world. The first implication is that this whole idea of mosques as spaces of devotion has somehow been dissented and marginalized. And a lot of the works that you see today, this fine book by Kiswar Rizvi, talks about how mosque has become ostentatious monuments, what she calls as the transnational mosque, a site of splendor and display, spectacle for people to see, but not really something that should be seen as places where Muslims were expressing Islam in their own unique way. Yeah. Is it unclear? Oh, it's okay.
I don't know how to fix it.
I think it has to do with the size of the thing. The size of the screen. You have to change the... We'll do that later then. Yeah, but you can read the thing, right? Okay, no problem. So that's the first thing. The second is that, and here we go a little bit into what Tavin has talked about, how mosque now has become sites of religious enclavement. And there are a lot of writings coming out from the West, especially the one by Elizabeth Becker, published by Chicago University Press. Mosques in the metropolis, incivility, caste, and contention in Europe. And she looks at mosques in Italy, in Turkey, and if I'm not wrong, in another place within Europe, showing how mosques then become places where Muslims retreat from the larger society. And the third kind of scholarly works that have come out because of this contestation over mosques is what Tavin was mentioning just now, mosques as spaces of gender struggles. So theoretically, this is how people have viewed mosques all over the world, especially in the academe. And I'm trying to say that we need to go beyond some of these dominant trends in studying mosques and to look at how Southeast Asians then manifest a kind of cosmopolitanism that you find in other ages of the Islamic world. We were just talking about this morning, that when you go to South Asian mosques, women are generally excluded, converts are judged when they go to South Asian mosques, but we don't see this in Southeast Asia. Why is it that mosques in Southeast Asia are very cosmopolitan? It has to do with the history of Southeast Asia itself. We know that the history of Southeast Asia has always been mediated by the coming of Sufism into the region, networks of scholars and missionaries that flowed into the region from India, Turkey, and the Arab world worked hand in hand with the Muslims to come up with a new dynamic, with a new cultural dynamic that showed a more softer and inclusive version of Islam. And this is something that I explored in my 1,000-year history of Islam in Malaysia, but actually it's an Islam in Southeast Asia as a whole. And because of that, there are 3 overlapping waves of mosque development. So when we look at mosques all over the world, we need to understand that mosques have gone through so many layers and transformations that have affected the texture of cosmopolitanism that we see in these mosques. From the time of the sultanates to the time of the colonial powers. Everybody now today tend to see colonialism as an ill or a setback in the Muslim world, but not so in Southeast Asia, because when the British, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the Americans came to Southeast Asia, they built mosques that were bigger than how the Malays had ever built in Southeast Asia, because mosques became sites where the colonial powers could placate the population. So you have a new form of cosmopolitanism that was developing under colonial rule, and with the globalization that has happened in Southeast Asia and all over the world, mosques then manifest the kind of cosmopolitanism that I will talk about later on. These 2 books have examined how there are epistemic continuities in how mosques have been designed and constructed and used, and because of it, we have now today in Southeast Asia, I'm not painting an idyllic picture, but I can safely say that at least 70 to 80% of the mosques that you see in Southeast Asia manifest this cosmopolitan feature in it. So what do we mean by mosques as cosmopolitan hubs? We need to register that there are scholarship coming out from Southeast Asia itself showing that there are mosques that show very extremist and exclusivist tendencies. And I don't deny this, but they are minority to the rule. The work by Joseph Gadak and Michael Feener, Challenging Cosmopolitanism, has shown that there are groups, there are pockets of extremist groups that use mosques as hubs by which they could sow divisions and discord in society. But they are a minority in the whole landscape of Southeast Asia. The first thing that you can see when you travel into Southeast Asia is what I call as aesthetic cosmopolitanism. In this work, Cosmopolitanism and Culture, Nikos, I can't even pronounce the Greek surname, argue that aesthetic cosmopolitanism does not simply refer to aesthetic representations of cosmopolitanism, but to a cosmopolitan worldview that is produced through aesthetics. And this is what you can see in Southeast Asia, a worldview, a tasawwur that is based on this idea that all men and women are equal in the eyes of God and that they are morally responsible towards one another. And you can see in how mosques are constructed. And this is a mosque in Kelantan. Kelantan is a state within Malaysia, known to be the most conservative state, run by ulama. So the heads of states in Kelantan has always been people who are trained in the Deobandi Madrasah in India or in Al-Azhar, and nowadays, of course, in Hijaz. But they are open to this kind of architectural forms. This is called the Beijing Mosque. So a mosque that looks exactly like a Chinese temple, but it is actually a mosque. And to mediate the so-called Chinese feature of it, they included, as you can see on the right, the minaret with a dome on top. So all of these mixtures of different forms, and later on we're going to hear more from our architect in the house about how these kind of mixtures come together. And we were talking about it yesterday during our trip at the Gusrefbek Mosque, that there's so many different designs that are not quintessentially Bosnian. It's like Turkish, maybe a little bit of Persian. Of course, the Iranians may not be happy with this, and a lot of other forms coming together. In fact, it's Roman in many ways. And of course, if you go to the Hajjah Fatima Mosque in Singapore, you can see right there on the left a feature that looks like a church, because the builder of the mosque was actually a British architect who wanted the mosque to blend in with a church that is just next door. And Muslims are fine with it. They celebrated this whole mixture of the minaret, the Saronic architectural form, with the Christian architectural form, to bring about this new dynamic that I was talking about just now. And this is, Aji is very familiar with this, the mosque in Java called the Menara Kudus Mosque, which looks totally like a Hindu temple. It was built a few hundred years ago, and Muslims did not even change the main feature of the mosque to ensure that the population that were generally Hindu could accept the mosque as part and parcel of their own landscape. So the aesthetics already show to us how mosques are very, very cosmopolitan. Now, another mosque is this one in Brunei. I had an opportunity to stay in Brunei for a year. It looks like a mosque in Mali. And our brother here from Senegal, I think you must be very familiar with this kind of architectural form. They took it from Mali and a bit of the Tangier, Moroccan kind of architecture, and infused it with Malay architectural form. So it's all these mixtures that are happening right now in the mosque in Southeast Asia. But that is just the outer layering of the mosque. When we talk about cosmopolitanism in the mosque, we are talking also about this whole idea of tolerance with other religions. So how do mosques, people who manage the mosque, people who frequent the mosque, now mix with other religions around them? And this is where I talk about the whole notion of sacred tolerance. This is evinced through the sharing of spaces within and outside specific religious sites. Adherents of different religions draw upon each other's spaces to ensure that their rites and rituals can be practiced easily and openly without inhibition. So you see, for example, if you go to Singapore, the Sultan Mosque, which is modeled upon the Ottoman Mosque, interestingly, that non-Muslims are allowed to enter into the mosque. And it's the same here, actually. Interestingly, they'll be given clothing where they can go in, and they will have displays to explain to the non-Muslims what Islam stands for, spirituality in Islam, the function of mosque in Islam, and the big topic right now is always women in Islam. So non-Muslims are encouraged to come into the mosque. And if you go to Sarawak, which is in East Malaysia, they hold joint events. So they would celebrate Christmas in the church next to the mosque, and then they would celebrate Eid in the mosque with the Christians. So you have all these things that are actually happening in many parts of Southeast Asia. They would do their iftar together in the mosque and celebrate this whole iftar experience with the non-Muslims. Mosques then become a place where different faiths could not only tolerate but also understand each other's beliefs. So what my work is trying to show is that mosques are not merely places where the devoted would spend their time in, but that the devoted would bring people who are out of that tradition to be incorporated into that tradition itself. So again, even in the conflicted parts of Philippines, and we know that there are always insurgency in Philippines, that Muslims and Christians would pray together in mosques and sometimes in churches in support of peace and tolerance. And of course, similar to the mosque in Kelantan, you have this, what we call as the Cheng Ho Mosque, a Chinese mosque, a mosque built by Chinese in the middle of Jakarta to show their pride in Chinese architecture, but at the same time, their hope to bring Chinese, who are majority non-Muslim in Indonesia, into the mosque to understand the Islamic tradition. So it's very interesting, this mosque, because they belong to an organization called the Organization of Chinese Indonesian Muslims, and they are reaching out to the Chinese Indonesian population to make them more aware of Islam and helping poor Chinese who are non-Muslims to come to the mosque to get help for anything that they need. So that's the second thing, mosque as sacred tolerance. Now I'm going to enter into what Tavin was mentioning just now, that when in America, and in other parts of the world, there are a lot of contestation over whether women could go to the mosque. In Southeast Asia, women have the right to be in the mosque because in all of the mosques in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and other parts of Southeast Asia, there will always be a space for women. It is not a permanent space because of Jum'ah, but outside Jum'ah, there will always be a special section for women. And this has to do with the fact that Southeast Asians, even though they don't intellectualize it, they understand, as what Mariam Katz has mentioned, that it is permissible for a woman to attend prayers in the mosque as long as she adheres to the Shari'i standards of modesty and gender segregation. Her husband may not forbid her. And if you know Southeast Asian women, they cannot be coerced to doing things that they don't like. Because we say in Southeast Asia, women has more power than men. And as long as she fulfills the condition, it is more meritorious for her to pray at home. And in Indonesia, for example, they have a special term for a special place for women. The term is called pawestren. This is a special room within the mosque where women are permitted to pray. In one part of Indonesia called Aceh, there is this community called the Gayo community. They actually allow women to go for Friday prayers every Friday. So it's almost like it has become almost compulsory for women to join men to go to Friday prayers with them because a special space has been provided for them. So a lot of this gender inclusivity can be seen. Typically, a mosque in Malaysia, for example, will look like this. There will be the same that you see here in the mosque. They will just set up a kind of barrier and women could come in. And because of this, female preachers have been very active in many mosques in Southeast Asia. They are giving lectures attended by thousands. Just now, the video that we see, those kinds of lectures have become a normalcy now, and there's a lot of studies now on female preachers in Southeast Asia, in mosques, filling up mosques. We don't have women giving khutbah yet, and I don't think it's going to be possible at all. But the point being that these spaces have already been there. Hence, there is no need for many of these women to even argue for the case that they need more space in the mosque because spaces are already, in a sense, predisposed for them, right? And of course, last but not least is this mosque. So this is a mosque in Philippines, a mosque that tried to appeal to the sensibilities of women. So it is colored totally in pink, and this is very like a hipster mosque, as we say. It's meant to be a mosque that attract women to come. So they've decided to paint it in that manner and built it in such a way that has more feminine features. And we see many of these mosques now being developed to ensure that women would come to the mosque, frequent the mosque, and give lectures at the mosque and participate in activities in the mosque. So I'd just like to end by saying that when we look at mosques in Southeast Asia, what we see is a long-standing flavor of Muslim cosmopolitanism. And this cosmopolitanism is not only expressed in terms of its architectural form, and also the kind of activities that these people who are managing the mosque have organized between Muslims and non-Muslims and between different groups in the Muslim community, but that it has always been inclusive of people of different genders, and allowing everyone and anyone to come into the mosque to use it as hubs of cosmopolitanism for themselves. Thank you very much.